Hi, so our topic is Domestic Servitude by Eden White, Malik Williams, Vicente Rivas, and Sophie Parr. So, domestic servants, the definition of domestic servitude are servants that work in employers' households where they are forced to cook, clean, care for children, etc., while getting underpaid, being overworked, and sometimes abused. Often, domestic servitude is just looked at as a live in nanny, someone who's helping clean the house, or even an au pair from another country. 68% of human trafficking is labor exploitation. So often when we talk about human trafficking, we think about agriculture or we think about sex trafficking specifically. But honestly, the majority of human trafficking is labor exploitation, which domestic servitude falls under that category. Who is affected by domestic servitude? Often it is undocumented immigrants who are looking for work to send money back home. It's mostly women and children, so women or young girls who are working in homes as cleaners or childcare and cooks, and they are often here in the United States to find work that will not get them deported, that can make them money to send back home and be stable because a lot of the reason people are here are for the money. 65% of domestic workers in the United States are immigrants or people of color. So, like I said, it's mainly women and girls, but usually those people are immigrating to the United States or they're people of color. And the reason why this is kind of interesting is because immigrants and people of color are people we already marginalize and oppress in the United States. So, it brings up an even bigger question of when these people are being human trafficked and being kept in domestic servitude, how can we help them if we don't even help them as a society in the first place? So, the three reasons why people stay in these situations are force, fraud, and coercion. So, these are kind of the push and pull factors that we've talked about in class quite a bit. So, the force would be use of physical power or violence, and this is often sexual abuse or physical abuse. Surveillance of the ongoings of one's life, so really restricting them and what actions they can take, and then restricting relationships. So, often they're not allowed to have relationships with their families or other people because they want to keep them under control as much as possible so that they have very little choice to leave this situation. Fraud, wrongful deception, or for personal gain. So this is false promises of stability or work that keep people in this work, and they're usually underpaid. So they're promised more money, more stability, like I said, and the fraud is that they're not paid this much, they're overworked, all that kind of stuff. And then coercion is the last one, which is persuasion through threats. We talk about this a lot in class. This is threat to family and threat to the individual, debt bondage, and threat of deportation. So I read a lot of research on people who have domestic servants take their identification away so that if they are caught, they're even more vulnerable because they're lacking identification and documentation. Where do domestic workers work across the world? So obviously we can see that the darker areas are East Asia and South America and Mexico, but I think the really interesting thing about this picture is that the minimum amount is 500,000 domestic workers, and that's places like the United States and Australia. And I think it's really interesting because if that's the bare minimum, if that's like the minimum amount of domestic workers, then we can just see how big of an issue this is and um, how hard it is for people to escape these situations. And again, we talk about if this is the choice, then what are the options that are given? So the reasons and root causes and contributions for domestic servitude are very similar to human trafficking as a whole. There's political, social, and economic. Political is really like the displacement in other countries. If they're displaced and there's civil unrest, they will look for asylum elsewhere or more stable areas elsewhere, and this could lead them to the United States. We also talked a lot about lack of government and lack of government action. In the United States, we have a lack of attention to human trafficking, and this could also be another reason why domestic servitude is so common. Social is the status of helping your family and being the person to really like provide the money for your family. And then the stigma, um, I'm not sure if this is a push or pull factor, but I feel like the stigma could kind of be both. It's stops people from helping in these situations, stops people from realizing the sin that is embedded in these situations. And then rejection. A lot of people are searching for some sort of stability, so they find themselves in these situations. Economic is a big one. People want cheap labor, they want cheap childcare, and other people are in debt bondage. So some people need cheap labor and they find people who are in need of money, and so they make a profit off of the lack of human dignity that they give them. Um, I am not a poet or a singer or anything, so I couldn't write my own poem, but I did find a snippet of a poem written by someone who is a domestic servant, and it's called Have You Heard of Me? I cannot lie, I feel kicked around like dirt, but I must try not to cry. My family is so hungry. I stay to help my mom. We've all been promised money, but they hold our lives in their palm. I'm not sure which is worse, needing to stay or needing to flee. I thought this poem was really interesting because it really covers everything, and this is just a snippet of the poem. Um, it really shows that, they feel kicked around like they don't feel like a human, they feel less than human, but they can't dwell on that. They have to provide for their family. They have to stay to help their family. They've been promised money, that's the fraud, but they hold their lives in the palm. That's the coercion. They have something over them. They're being manipulated. I'm not sure which is worse, needing to stay or needing to flee. This kind of goes back to the discussion of if this is the choice, then what are the options? And this really leads us into the conversation of, how this sin is perpetuated in our country, in the world, and how this is sinful in the Christian tradition.
So now we're going to talk about some of the main traffic flows that we see in domestic servitude. First and foremost, some of the things we've talked about before, but some of the things that make domestic servitude stand out as from different forms of human trafficking is the type of work they do. They're usually kept prisoners in homes, working as nannies, maids, or domestic help. A lot of the victims of domestic servitude are hidden in plain sight, so when they're forced to work in the homes across the United States, they're seen as just a normal nanny or healthcare worker, when in fact they're being held against their will and unable to leave. Traffickers sometimes take victims' identification papers and travel documents in order to limit their freedom. So this goes into a lot of some of the traffic flows and why those work because of these different methods that they use to keep them in the home. Throughout my research, I found two main ways that we see domestic servitude play out more commonly in the world and in the United States. The first method that we see is wealthy people in poor countries. Wealthy people in poor countries exploiting the poor in that native country, in their native country. As long, in most cases, as long as there's poverty that is below the level of the person that they're imprisoning in their domestic servitude, we do not see them getting punished. This is due mostly to weaker governments are more susceptible to bribes and misconduct from these these wealthy individuals in the country that are engaging in domestic servitude. And while this is a pretty general rule, there's a lot of different innuendos and differences that go between person to person, whether it was forcibly forced to work at their home, or they were coerced, or some version of fraud was used. Either way, this is one of the main traffic flows that we see across the world. And then for the United States, more specifically, and for some other wealthier countries, wealthy people in wealthy countries, it is very common for the traffickers to offer food, home, and shelter to daughters that are in a poor country abroad, and they pay for them to come over into the United States. And in doing so, in that payment process of helping them get to the United States, they use that leverage as having a large debt they have to pay off. Very, very similarly to a lot of the sex trafficking and some of the things we've talked about in class, where they have to pay all the fines for all the different people that help them illegally immigrate into the country. And once they're in the country and they're working for these families as working in the homes as helpers and maids, and they find a hard time to pay back what they owe because the wages are often not what they expected, if at all. and they get stuck in this cycle of acquiring debt when during immigration that it's impossible for them to work off. And as we've read many cases in our class, more commonly they do not get worked off. Um, and in some cases, workers are often passed down from family members to others. So just because a family is getting old or no longer requiring the service of this domestic servant, they still like to keep them in the loop, and pass them down to another family member. And so throughout my research, I found one example that encapsulated a few of the different. Her story was unique because of the how she exhibited much of the different trafficking flows that we see in the world. Uh, Lola was her name. She was born in the Philippines, and she at first, which was offered a food and shelter and a place to food and shelter by a rich man that was living in the Philippines and was working for their family for a while. And after a while, when the man no longer required her services, he passed her down as a gift to the family we see right here today. She is in the left. She is the one taking care of those three children that are not hers. And on the right, we see her on the right picture. We see her on the far right, again with the family after they had immigrated into the United States, where she was passed down from generation to generation as a maid that took care of the five children you see in the picture. This is a great example because she started off in her home country being exploited, and that carried on into moving to the United States, where she was kept in a cycle of acquiring debt and not making enough money to be able to leave out on her own, which caused her to be trapped in this domestic servitude for her whole life. Because yeah, they were untrue about the wages she'd be earning and how much it would cost for her to be able to uh, be free and go home and give her family money. Uh, that being said, since those are two very common forms of human trafficking, in my research, I found that there's still a lot of cases that fall outside those two norms. Uh, Less common, some examples are in poor communities. They use various methods of force, fraud, and coercion to put their own community members in domestic servitude. Uh, so the research that I've read found that in these situations where a person is being trapped in their own community by someone else of not of a but a similar economic standing, it is a lot they're trapped inside as to not be seen by the rest of the community, for the rest of the community to see what is happening. So throughout various methods of force, fraud, and coercion, people are people are trafficking people into domestic servitude inside their own communities. And and yeah, those were a few of the common trafficking flows that I found throughout my research on domestic servitude.
Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to be examining some of the ethical and theological parameters to domestic servitude, in particular, within the realm of human trafficking. So, there are evidently a number of ethical violations that domestic servitude commits against the human person and the broader human community. First, domestic servitude in itself is an act of labor injustice. Domestic servants are overworked, underpaid, and even abused in their attempts to make a living. And that kind of labor contradicts the theological purpose for work, which is to participate in God's creation in a way that is dignified, productive, and beneficial. And domestic servitude is a prime example of profit at the expense of human dignity. And this is where people serve the economy rather than the other way around. And this also brings us to how domestic servitude is an act of social sin. Clearly, it is an egregious individual sin on the part of the perpetrator, but beyond that, it is a structural ill, in that domestic servitude as an industry plays into and is influenced by systemic inequalities. The majority of domestic servants in the United States are from marginalized groups, indicating that there's an absence of preferential option for those already oppressed populations. Oftentimes, domestic servitude is the most financially feasible choice for immigrants who are struggling to find work in a country that has limited resources for their welfare. And domestic servitude is like other industries that capitalize on immigrant labor while shielding the abuse and mistreatment of workers occurring beneath the surface. So in this way, it contributes to persisting race and class inequalities, which makes domestic servitude a social or structural sin. Domestic servitude is ultimately a grave violation of human dignity. Since each individual is endowed with the image and likeness of the creator, thus each individual is intrinsically valuable and warrants respect. And the absence of dignified wages and benefits, the excessive laboring, the bodily and psychological harm inflicted on workers, these are all ways in which domestic servitude denies individuals their inherent worth. It essentially allows for them to be treated as lesser than the crown of God's creation, lesser than just human beings. And to treat someone in such a demeaning way and to reduce them to something less than what is intended for them and what is deserved by them is an extreme moral wrong. It ultimately strips them of their opportunity to pursue personal fulfillment and happiness. And their personal and theological life journey is ultimately thwarted by their work, which is something that should never deplete someone so much to that extent, and it should actually benefit and add to that personal journey. I wanted to include a survivor testimony just because in efforts to highlight their voices, because their voices trumps my analysis every time, and it is crucial that we give them that opportunity to share their story, because in that, I think it is an extremely rehabilitative process, and they deserve that platform to reclaim their humanity and reclaim that freedom that was taken from them. So here is a testimony from a domestic worker from BBC News. So I will play it right now.
If I never argue with them, still I will be their slave. My job was to take care of them, take care of the house, take care of all their needs. They never allowed me to go outside. When they go outside, I have to be with them. And when they go outside, they have to lock me inside the house. I don't have any privacy. I sleep in the living room. No bathroom to take my shower. My things are all placed in the toilet. Every day, 24 hours on call, no day off, no freedom. They only verbally abused me, calling me names as stupid, animal, garbage. I respect the family where I'm working, but they never show me respect. Even by the food, how sometimes they eat scrap foods from the plate and not from the serving plate. I feel as if I'm flying up on air. Like before, my feeling is just I was carrying a heavy load on me. Now that I'm free, I feel very, very happy. Recovering from emotional and mental abuse is very difficult. Still, how many times I forget, but it always pops up in my mind. Although how much I miss my family, although how much I miss my daughter, going back is not my priority now, because as a breadwinner of the family, I have to work. My advice to anybody who's working in a housemaid, being abused, just Continue to be brave. Think of your family. Don't do anything bad. And wait for the time you're ready to fight for your rights.
Hello, everybody. This is going to be my portion of my presentation on domestic servitude, and I'll be focusing specifically on domestic servitude in the United States. So yeah, let's get started. So for my portion, I did the Kahoot. So I know it's supposed to be less than 10 minutes for my part, so I'll get right into it. So I'll allow you guys to answer each question, and then after that question, I'll kind of briefly elaborate and try to give you guys as much information as possible in less than 10 minutes. So let's get right into it. I will share my screen. Oh, don't look at that. All right, so it's only 10 seconds because it's virtual, so just take your time, read the question, and try to answer before time goes up. And yeah, so the answer is foreign women. Obviously, I think all these other ones can be answers as well, but foreign women specifically is the answer because they are mostly at risk of manipulation, coercion, fraudulent claims. And so a lot of times they come documented or undocumented to the United States for new opportunities. And so since they're not from this country, it kind of places them at an even greater risk than these other options of being exploited. Yeah, move on to the next question. Who was most which amendment in the U.S. Constitution prohibits involuntary servitude? Yes, 13th Amendment. And I'll just briefly read off the amendment to you. So neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And so I had a discussion question. I'll just read it off to you and you can think about it in your head. But has the 13th Amendment done as good a job of combating new slavery, and in this case, domestic servitude, as it did old slavery? And so I would argue no. I think just to really touch on this, I think, things continue to change, and the 13th Amendment was a great way to kind of combat or eliminate slavery back in this time. But I think as the times change, you kind of have to adapt and create things that address the new needs. And so the 13th Amendment doesn't do a great job of protecting people with who are in different new forms of slavery, like sex trafficking, domestic servitude, and other forms of labor trafficking. So I think there definitely needs to be new laws that kind of put in place. So the next slide is who is most likely to discover or report incidents of domestic servitude? And yeah, the answer is non-government officials. And in this case, I like to say neighbors because neighbors are the closest to the situation. And so just to kind of give you guys a brief case study that kind of illustrates my point, it is the story of Maria and Sandra Bearden of Laredo, Texas. And so in The Slave Next Door, we learn of Sandra, an upper middle class mother with a solid brick home and a manicured lawn. She wanted a housemaid and nanny, but didn't want to pay a lot for the services. She traveled to Mexico, where she promised a set of parents that she provided an education for their daughter in the United States. She smuggled their daughter, Maria, into the U.S. and immediately imprisoned her in Texas. Sandra, currently serving a life sentence for trafficking in persons, sprayed Maria with pepper spray, hit her with brooms and bottles, and even sexually assaulted Maria with a gardening tool. She even chained Maria to a pole in the backyard and fed her dog feces. Luckily, an attentive neighbor finally saw Maria in the backyard and reported the crime to authorities. So this is just really a great illustration of the way some domestic servants are exploited and kind of coerced into these situations. But it also shows how neighbors are the best person to kind of report these situations because they are close to the home, they can get close to the families, and they kind of see, at least decently see what's going on in the home. And so I think neighbors are kind of the best option because, obviously law enforcement can't go into people's homes and kind of just, do a search. So I think neighbors are the best option in these situations. So what was the name of the measure implemented in 2000 that was the first law to address human trafficking? Yeah, so the TVPA of 2000 was the first comprehensive law to address trafficking in persons. And it kind of addressed three main areas, which were prevention, protection, and prosecution. And to kind of keep it up with the times, they updated every so often. And so the most recent one was in 2017. And I think this is done kind of a decent job of kind of combating domestic servitude, but I don't think it's done a great job. Obviously, these things kind of still go on undercover and unregulated. So there's still a lot more that can be done in terms of protecting people from these situations. But I think the TVPA has done at least a decent job of addressing these things and kind of putting that three-pronged approach of protection, prosecution, and prevention. So what is the main form of trauma or coercion that domestic servants face? Well, so yeah, so like other forms of trafficking, they obviously face physical and behavioral and all these other forms of trauma and abuse, like we touched on in my case study. But I think psychological is the most prevalent example because, I think when you're in somebody's home for so long, it's easy to kind of get wear down mentally, kind of get broken down, and kind of just be resigned to the fact that this is your situation. It's just psychologically, that can really be draining and just take a toll on a person, so they don't want to even try and escape anymore. And also psychologically, it really can weigh on them in terms of like believing that they or their families will continue to be hurt, and kind of leads them to kind of just remain in situations without trying to escape. So what is a common pattern among domestic servants? Yeah, all of the above. And just kind of add on to these, I think I found a few other ones which include confiscation of travel documents if they have any, withholding of wages, obviously, confinement, no time off, isolation from the community and family and friends, physical and sexual abuse, degrading treatment, malnourishment, and the threat of arrest and deportation as an undocumented immigrant. So what's some key indicators of a person trapped in domestic servitude? Yeah, so I kind of touched on all these are a little earlier, but I think all these are kind of indicators of somebody who's in domestic servitude. They have no documents, so that means that they have been either withheld or they are illegally immigrated to this country. Lack of independence, they aren't afforded the freedom to kind of go as they please and kind of have some autonomy. And then trauma, obviously some physical trauma, you can see maybe scars in their bodies, psychological trauma, they can look beaten down, broken down mentally. So yeah, I think these are all just great indicators of somebody who is in domestic servitude. So true or false, 46% of domestic servants involve non-citizens, cases involve non-citizens, excuse me. Yeah, that is actually false. The number is actually a lot higher than that. It's actually 76% of domestic servitude cases involve non-citizens. So I think that really just shows the vulnerability of immigrants to this country. And it kind of shows the focus of people who are looking for domestic servants. They are looking for people who don't know this country very well, who are just trying to find new opportunities, looking for work, and that leaves them extremely vulnerable to this form of trafficking, especially. Next question. So true or false, victims of domestic servitude have little protection under the law. And that is actually true. So even though we talk about the TVPA and the 13th Amendment, actually domestic servitude is very poorly regulated and underrepresented. And it really goes unregulated. So I have a quote that says, domestic servitude is pervasive in the United States due to the lack of workplace protections for domestic servants when compared to other laborers under labor laws. Consequently, these domestic servants are typically employed without contracts, unregulated and unenforced workplaces with minimal legal recourse for labor violations. And the absence of legal protections and combined with social isolation and lack of personal agency contribute to the incidence of forced labor and domestic servitude in this form of trafficking. And so, like I said, even though we talk about some of these protections or these laws or measures that have been implemented, actually, this is a very underrepresented and underregulated form of trafficking. And it really, I think, needs to be addressed. So what is the main reason domestic servants not turn to local law enforcement to leave their situation or to escape their situations? Yeah, so I think this may be a little bit surprised, is lack of trust. Obviously, corruption is very apparent in other countries, and it's still vaguely apparent in the United States, but I think lack of trust is especially prevalent because like immigrants and domestic servants may be reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement, not only out of fear of violence from their exploiters, but also out of fear of law enforcement itself. And so the possibility of not qualifying for a visa and risking the threat of deportation also discourages exploited immigrants or domestic servants from seeking help. And so when they do escape and they find themselves in situations where they're talking to law enforcement or police or things like that, they place them in a very precarious situation because they are not only afraid of law enforcement, but they also are afraid of being deported and kind of, put back into, jobless situations outside of the country. And so finally, what can ordinary citizens do to combat domestic servitude? Yeah, so have good relationships with your neighbors. I think, like I said before, that is a great way to kind of combat domestic servitude, to kind of scope out situations like this, because neighbors are the closest ones to these situations. They can, become close with the family, become close with the victim, and kind of just see what's going on in the area. And so that will allow them to get a grasp of who's in the home and actually become very aware of situations where somebody is becoming a domestic servant and they are being exploited. And so this can lead them to the next thing, which is alert law enforcement of suspicious behavior. And this, like I said, police can't really go into the home unless they have due cause. So if a neighbor is kind of reporting a situation, they have the authority to call the police, and they will kind of do their due diligence to kind of help these people escape. And so I think that is the best approach to kind of combating domestic servitude and getting people out of these situations. And so, yeah, guys, that's been my presentation. Hope I didn't go over too long, but yeah, thanks for watching.